What did you think of those articles that I sent over?
Man, the skill acquisition paper is pretty dense.
Yeah. Good, like kind of, comprehensive review.
Yeah.
Though, hey?
Yeah, I mean, it's fun to read for sure. It's just not a quick read, right? Like, be, you know, ecological dynamics, complexity theory, they start to get they slow you down a little bit.
It seems a lot more like it's almost like this self-relation thing, right? Like, look at all these big words I can use and how complicated I can make this. And I get that, yes, there are lots of systems at play and it makes sense, worth considering. But I don't think it's like it should be the cornerstone of motor learning or skill acquisition.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems a little bit unnecessary, right? It's like quite verbose. Um, and like there's a funny, I copied a quote from this because it's like a really long, wordy sentence and then a very, very simple rephrasing right after it. It's like you could have just done the same.
Yeah. A lot of those reviews or the two were like quite critical of it, right? And it seemed
Mhm.
like the second one was also somewhat critical. And I think I might have read the same one that you read, where it was like, in other words, it's like it doesn't need to be this complicated. I'm trying to make a point here.
Yeah. Yeah. But it is interesting. And some of it probably does need to be, I mean, you do need to use technical terminology, right? To properly explain what you mean. Uh, and it's super interesting, the ecological dynamics, the environmental implications in practice and stuff. It's all very interesting. I think, it seemed right away to be more applicable to team sports with a environment that is more highly variable than ours, potentially, right? Like we're in the gym. There's
Yeah.
a lot fewer, there's much fewer variables inside the gym.
Especially that concept of affordedness or affordances,
Yeah, the
where it's
affordances.
essentially opportunities, right? Like, you know, since I've been coaching jujitsu, one of the things that I like, the constant question I get, and we're going to get off topic here, but kind of the point of the podcast is I don't know what to do. I'm like, okay, well, let's try and draw some parallels between something that you might understand, right? Like team sports, right? Let's use hockey, right? At the face off, both teams are 50-50. Nobody's got the puck. We're organized in a way that gives us equal attack and defense strategies. And then as you progress along the ice and you organize your team in different formats, that determines the level of attack, defend strategy that you have at play. And that's a lot of what they're talking about with ecological dynamics. So in jujitsu, I'm trying to teach people, like, at what point are you even in a position to take a shot on net? So when should you attempt a submission? Well, it's not probably from like on your knees with your arms stretched out in side control or from top half guard or one of these positions. What you need to do is you need to progress further and further. And ideally what you get to, the kind of position you find yourself in is like a 5-on-3 man alone in front of the net, right? You've completely immobilized your partner. They have no defenses left. And then you have free reign to attack whichever submission you want. But people, like, especially as beginners, they don't understand this attack defend concept. And they're just firing shots on net. But the moment they get over the red line, flat shot. It's like high and wide, or it's on the ice, it's intercepted. And then it's, like it's a 3-on-1 in the other direction. There's all of these kind of like um, comparable situations that come from that. But when you understand sport, you can start to apply those dynamics to different sports. And that's a really hard thing to understand within jujitsu. like you say, sport versus CrossFit, I think there are more ecological, like, perturbations, I guess you could call them. The one I made a note of it here. I won't be able to find it because this doc we've got going is a bit of a mess. But respiratory rate and like stability and bracing requirements. This is a conversation I had with one of my clients yesterday, where, like, let's say you're doing wall balls, right? What is the stability requirement of a wall ball? It's quite low, assuming that you are strong. So you hopefully have the ability to exchange oxygen and position your diaphragm and the stability requirements of your core in different positions throughout the movement. And you can adjust that respiration pattern. Now, if we go to heavy squat cleans, those ecological demands are going to start to kind of like squish you and squeeze you. If you're just doing squat cleans and it's one squat clean, 2-minute rest between sets, then all you have are the stability requirements. But if you're doing 30 squat cleans per time at 80% of 1 RM, now you've got high respiration, and those two things are going to compete with one another. Your ability to descend the diaphragm, expand the thorax, and create negative pressure there to draw air in, and then push that back out, and how your core contracts in relation to that to stabilize the lumbar spine so that you can transfer force from your legs through your upper body. And people will just reach a threshold where those two things cannot coexist. And they either experience dramatic loss in force production or a need to break. We also see that stuff in gymnastics movements where you can, like, people are holding their breath. They're washing their hands upside down. They're learning to do chest to bar pull-ups, and they're just holding their breath for a set of 60 days reps. Holding their breath. They come down and they're like, oh, I'm so tired, I'm out of breath. You're like, well, you held your breath for like 15 seconds there. I would imagine that you would be.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, within CrossFit, probably the biggest ecological dynamic component that we have to deal with, outside of things like, hot running conditions, variable terrain conditions. The stress of competition is probably one that would be worth bringing up. Like, there were so many times, especially at local comps, where people have been like, oh, it ran 3 hours behind. Or I got 5 minutes of warm up and then I had to go out and hit a 1-rep max. And it's just not an optimal scenario. So it's interesting for sure. And then in terms of movement variability, that kind of stuff with CrossFit, if you're doing a whole bunch of rowing in wall balls, rowing in chest to bars, rowing in kettlebell swings, bike, and whatever, right? Like, there's going to be fatigue patterns that they can either stack on top of each other, or if you have more movement variability, which is something that we've talked about in the past, those fatiguing regions of your body don't necessarily have to stack if you've developed yourself with broad enough range. I guess that fits into ecological dynamics as well.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like kind of a different take on it, I guess. Whereas we have like fewer environmental dynamics with weather or terrain. Still some, outdoor events, still some, but definitely fewer than, like, the sport that immediately came to my mind was golf, because that's maximizing those variables, right? It's like wind and terrain is like, can change your score by like 10 or 20 strokes.
Yeah. Yeah. Even like humidity, moisture, precipitation, all of that stuff. Yeah. I think more like combat sports would probably be the highest level and the most consequential too.
Yeah.
Right? Like MMA has got to be the highest level of example of ecological dynamics, where, I thought, well, again, going back to jiu-jitsu, I talk about this with my students, where it's like, you have to develop a sensitivity to what's going on. You have to be present. So we'll just start some classes with like 1-minute rounds of grip fighting. It's like, okay. And this kind of folds into deliberate practice, but You need to be paying attention to what's happening here. Don't just fight to get the best grip. Try and understand when you push them in this way, how do they respond? And what if they don't respond in the way that you want them to respond? Then what does that open up? And what kinds of different attacks can you redirect yourself towards based upon the reaction of your opponent? And that's a really good example of, I guess, ecological dynamics in practice.
Yeah. And that brings in the different types of learning there, right? It's in the moment, things are happening much too quickly to be at the cognitive level.
Mhm.
But in that first paper you sent, they talk about integrating the knowledge about what happened to further the development, to further the learning. So you're performing, things are happening quickly, you're just executing. But then afterwards, with some processing, some more cognitive processing, you can learn better, right? You can enhance your learning. And they even talked about the different like stimuli, right? So that how did they put it? Different like sensory modalities. So yeah, having that kind of like review of the performance can enhance the learning, right? Whereas, some of the learning is kind of automatic, right? It's just purely neurological changes. You bring in the review, the cognitive processing, and you can kind of like start to build a model.
Yeah. Let's use that as like our jumping off point for kind of laying down a foundation for understanding motor development or skill acquisition, I guess is what we're calling it. But we'll start with the nervous system because that's what's controlling it, right? Like we've got these cortical and subcortical regions, conscious and subconscious. So you're thinking about doing things and then you're building pathways in terms of how to do them. This ties in with this continuum that I teach athletes, students, as well as other coaches, which is unconscious incompetence. You're bad and you don't even know it. Conscious incompetence. You're bad, like you understand that what you're doing is not the correct technique, but you don't know how to do it. Conscious competence. You can do it with conscious thought, and then unconscious competence. You can do it naturally. And where that flows is through the development of the nervous system and myelination. Myelination is just like, think of it as this thickness or the conductivity of the nerves themselves. And the thicker that is, and the more conductive it is, the more developed that pathway is going to be, and the more likely you're going to flow through that motor pattern. So if we have somebody who, we've seen these videos on social media of like teaching my friend how to jump, and you're like, that person doesn't know how to jump. What? I have so many questions. Or like running or whatever. It's just the structure is not there. And I like to use the analogy of city infrastructure. Right? The more a road gets used, the more traffic that flows down it, the more investment is going to go into the infrastructure of that roads. They're going to need sidewalks. They're going to need more lanes. They're going to need regular maintenance on asphalt, line painting, taking care of like rainwater, curb and gutter, all of that stuff needs to go into that to make sure that things flow as efficiently as possible. And that's myelination of the nervous system, is a robust structure. And then that's what is going to give us better motor patterns. So that's what forms our motor patterns. So I guess that's kind of like my understanding of the groundwork of skill acquisition. Would you have a much broader education around the subject, but would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I think there's probably other changes at the level of the nervous system other than just myelination, right? So there's more synapses forming in those pathways between those neurons that are forming that, that motor pattern, or that result in that motor pattern. And then there would also be trimming of other pathways that are less efficient, right? So other ways, less efficient, less effective ways to do that task will also get like trimmed away so that you just can't do it poorly as much. And that goes for anything, right? It goes for any process, any changes in the brain, right? There's synapses forming, and there's a different term for it than trimming that I can't remember, but
Pruning.
the one that came to mind.
Pruning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The whole thing is
neuroplasticity.
neuroplasticity. Right?
Yeah.
Like that's the overarching term of what you're describing. And then the tagline is if you don't use it, you lose it. Not like in 40-Year-Old Virgin.
Is it true?
Fellas, our cocks are not going to fall off. But, and that's essentially what you're describing, right? Is like we're streamlining our process. We're getting rid of the excess unnecessary stuff because our body is just an efficiency machine. All it cares about is efficiency. So things that are getting used more often, get used more often. Things that aren't get neglected. And then, like you say, pruning.
Yeah. And then part of that development becomes less conscious, less effortful as well. So those motor patterns seem to become more automatic. I don't think anything is truly automatic, because even when you put in a good effort, you still hold your breath. So even breathing's not automatic, but they become more automated, right?
Yeah.
Probably because they're more.
Well, there are like deep tendon reflexes, right? And then there's research that's gone into motor patterns, mechanotransduction, things like gait patterns are essentially automatic.
Yeah.
And that stuff happens almost completely subcortical, right? Like all at the level of the spinal cord.
Yeah.
Which
I guess I should have said it's potentially automatic, but it can be still interfered with. With other competing processing, right? So like if the example that one of our professors, our gate professor gave us, Bill McIntyre, he was great. He would have students come up to the front of the room, walk across at their just normal pace. And then he would introduce more and more complex cognitive tasks, and you just watch them slow down. So it's like even gait can be pretty easily interfered with, even though it is like kind of automatic.
I guess that leads, I don't know if we're ready to go there or not. Again, these notes that we've got are so jumbled, but it kind of leads into the practical ideas of skill acquisition, in which we want to develop each skill to a level that we would call competence. And then under this ecological dynamics perspective, start introducing more and more and more stressors so that we have skill mastery, right? If you can get to the point where your squat cleans at 80% look the same. One of my favorite videos that I ever watched was in 2013, we did a hundreds workout, 100 wall balls, 100 chest to bars, 100 alternating dumbbell snatch, 100 alternating pistols. Oh. And this was like prime Rich Froning, right? He was so good. And he got to the pistols and every single pistol was exactly the same. And they were all like, you would look at it and you'd be like, that's a perfect pistol. And he just would be like 10, walk forwards, 10, walk forwards, 10. And he just chewed through those pistols. And that's a really good example of movement mastery or technical mastery within a specific skill that few people can ever hope to achieve.
Yeah. You get through the early phases by trying to potentially like optimize or facilitate the learning, right? When things are really, really hard, you try to make it kind of potentially make it easier so that there's maybe not so much frustration, maybe not too many mistakes, good technique, good habits. And then as it becomes better and better, you actually go the other direction, right? You try to challenge that ability, because if you don't challenge them, it's going to be perfect every time, and it isn't going to engage any kind of adaptation. It's just going to be maintenance. There was a quote in here. I might be able to find it quickly. They said even mentioned boredom as part of that, right? They said, here it is. This requires a careful balance between promoting successful executions that help to construct an effective representation within long-term memory, but also making some performance errors in practice to encourage retrieval attempts from long-term memory, thereby preventing boredom setting in and a lack of learning due to overly monotonous repetitions.
Mm-hmm.
I love that.
Yeah. We try to encourage, like when I'm talking to other coaches, I always try to encourage at like a roughly 80 to 90% success rate. Obviously, there's wiggle room within that. It's enough consistency to make sure that we're reinforcing what we want to reinforce, but it's also enough challenge that there's room to grow and learn there. A really good, like, think about any type of vehicle racing, dirt bikes, cars, F1. You have to imagine that all of those people have crashed at some point because they went too fast, right? Or skidded out or made some sort of error where they went too fast and pushed the limits too hard. And that's essentially what we want to do, is we want to find our limit and operate as close to that limit as we possibly can. And that, like, roughly 80 to 90% success rate is good at driving adaptation towards skill development. And then the point that you made, making sure that we can actually maintain task engagement.
Would you say that you would vary that a lot between different like movements? Let's just say like weightlifting versus gymnastics movements. Would that hold? Like in terms of the 80 to 90%, I'm assuming you wouldn't want them to only make 80% of their lifts in dedicated weightlifting practice.
What I would say is, like, when I coach it to other coaches, within CrossFit there, they have a list of points of performance, and across a set of 10 reps per se, you want to see all of those points of performance hit on 8 or 9 out of 10. And then it's time to progress and increase the difficulty. So if we're snatching, right, we want to see, like, I'm working with an athlete and I want to see them keep the bar close to their body. I want to see them maintain a consistent back angle off the floor. I want to see them reach triple extension, and I want to see them receive the bar lower than a quarter squat, because for a lot of people, realistically, receiving the bar lower than a parallel squat is like, that's like elite level stuff. So I want to see them receive the bar lower than a quarter squat with an appropriate overhead position. So we've got 5 or 6 points performance. And we're going to do, let's say we're doing 4 triples. If after the third triple, they hit all of those points of performance every single time, then I'll increase the load. And that's how I measure it. Same goes with gymnastics, right? Like, so let's take a ring muscle up, for example. I want to see you maintain a smooth arch position, eyes forwards, toes down, open through the shoulder, proper respiration pattern. I want to see you keep your toes down during the transition and not, like, kick yourself in the face. And then time the dip so that as you come out of the transition and the legs come back, you're pulling up and hitting the dip. And those are my points of performance. If you do that on 8 or 9 out of 10 reps in a row, then we'll try more. But if you can't, then I'm not going to bother making it harder.
Yeah. Yeah. Cause then you'll just encourage, well, not necessarily intentionally encourage, but you're promoting or practice, right?
Right. Which is another concept that I lean really heavily on, which is that practice does not make perfect. Practice makes permanent. Perfect practice makes perfect. So I always use this example of having a good bucket and a bad bucket, or two wolves, right? Whichever wolf you feed. We want to get as many reps as we can funneled into this good bucket. And that's what's going to promote that development of that specific neural pathway so that it becomes more subconscious. And the more we can do that, the more we can fill that bucket up, the bigger the bucket needs to be, the better we move. But if we're just going through the motions and we're feeding both buckets with an equal number of reps, how are we developing anything other than just the practice of going through the motions?
Yeah. And then it will get harder to, it cuts both ways, right? It's not only fewer good reps, but it's also more time later on to undo the learning of the, less efficient technique.
Yeah. It could be, I say that with all caps, italics, underline, bold, could be an advantage later on because it expands your range and it's given you more movement options. But if we're talking just purely about skill acquisition, we want to see the skill developed and then start applying other external stresses to expand that range is a much better strategy than to just be like, oh yeah, it's all good. Which brings me to my first pushback on this whole ecological dynamics model, which is I have seen in the past, and I still see it, and it really kind of irks me, coaches who, I don't want to call it lazy. I feel like maybe complacent is a better term, but they make these statements of like, the athlete will organize around the demands of the task, and what will be, will be. And if they were meant to be great, they would be great. We're just going to give them reps. And if they figure it out, they'll be great. And if they don't, then they were never going to be great anyway. And it just blinds me. They're like, we can be more as coaches. I feel like we can be much more than that. And it doesn't take a whole lot of effort to be more than that. A little bit of care and attention. And you can use the concepts that we've discussed and we'll discuss further to make a really positive change in people as far as skill acquisition goes. It's not just an automatic do or don't, or what happens will be the best outcome that they can hope for. I don't ascribe to that belief.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's just obviously not true. I think, if you've watched or paid attention to sport at all, or you've done any coaching, it's just like obviously not the case. There are some like just exceptional individuals that do pick something up and self-organize and become great. But even those cases, they're almost never as good as the person that maybe took a little longer to pick it up, put in much more work. So yeah, I think it's just not obvious as that's true.
Yeah. You talked about golf and you hear these stories about like Phil Mickelson and Tiger Woods and how many balls they would hit even around tournament play. You're like, well, obviously you're the best. You're hitting 10,000 balls a week. You're going to be pretty good. And it's deliberate practice too. They're just not out there crushing balls. They're trying to do stuff. Low, medium, high, fades, hooks, slices, all of it. Straight, different spins on the ball. Really impressive stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. But all those guys have had a lot of coaching too, right? So, I mean, there's some great natural players out there, but I don't think anyone's ever been as good as Tiger Woods was in his prime. And he's had a lot of coaching.
Have you seen those Tiger Woods facts?
Oh yeah. The consecutive weeks at number one in the world.
Man.
Hilarious.
Green.
Yeah.
I'm going to try it.
Or his putting percentage inside of whatever it is, like 5 or 6 feet.
Okay, here we go.
I think he missed like, I can't remember the stats. He missed like 1 putt a year at inside of 5 feet or some shit, like something stupid, or inside 3 feet. But the weeks at number one, it was the equivalent of 11 years.
683 weeks,
Yeah. 12 years.
13 years. The next best was Greg Norman with 331 weeks.
Wild. Yeah. I mean, Scheffler, I think people think Scotty Scheffler has a chance, but he's got to be, not fall off at all for another 8 years, 10 years. I don't know.
Yeah, I can't think of these too much. Okay. Back to ecological dynamics. This is something that I do consider really heavily, which is the nature nurture. Have you listened to much of Sam Harris and his thoughts around free will?
Tons.
And essentially, in his opinion, I don't know, I think there's definitely like degrees of truth to this, but like our outcomes are predetermined, especially the further down our life we go. Our past experiences, our genetics, all of that is going to determine what we can and will do. And where I really lean into that is, especially with people in CrossFit, because most people get into CrossFit late in life, is their past experiences. And those can be the physiological experiences, like how our body developed, how our muscles and tendons developed in size and in fiber type distribution and in insertion and origin, how our bones developed, density, length, joints, the physiological stuff, our lungs and our hearts and our vascular system. All of that stuff is going to be determined in large part genetically, but also through development. And then you just drop somebody into this sport. You're like, okay, go now go be great. And it is like really hard. And we have to consider all of those extra variables when we're looking at how people will move, how they should move, how we coach them to move. Those experiences are also social. What were their experiences like with coaches in the past, their parents, teachers? How do they respond to different coaching strategies? All of that stuff is going to influence the way that they acquire motor skills. And I do think that when you're looking at ecological dynamics as this, like there's so many variables, that's one kind of little bubble of those variables that we do need to be really conscious of.
Yeah. And the more experiences they've had, the more things you have to consider, the more you potentially have to adjust and meld your approach, right?
Mm-hmm.
Working with youth, they have fewer experiences that have, formed those habits or those physiological changes. So you probably have a bit more of a blank slate to work with, but yeah, the older and more experienced the athlete, the more you have to consider those things probably.
Yeah. Yeah. An example would be like a lot of times I'll use when I'm teaching lifting, I'll use a jump primer. I'm like, okay, guys, we're going to do, what I want you to think about this lift is as a jump. And I think it's a really good way to get people to move well. But every now and then I'll get somebody who does a jump and I'm like, that's not how you jump. Like, come over here, jump and reach that. And then they completely change what they're doing. They're like, why did you jump this way over here? They're like, oh, well, I just thought you meant this. And that is formed by past experiences. Again, back to teaching weightlifting. One of the things that I see that gets in people's way a lot is this breakdown of first, second, and third pull. Where what we talk about is during the first pull, the back angle is maintained, the knees move out of the way of the barbell, and the weight shifts slightly posterior. And then during the second pull, that's when we start to see an uprighting of the torso and a rebend or the double knee bend before we begin our vertical extension. And so people are intentionally training double knee bend. You're like, well, double knee bend is a consequence of vertical jump. It's not something that comes first, or aggressive hip contact. People are like, I know it's important to bring the bar into my hips. Like, yeah, but that comes second to doing proper positions, which comes second to executing the lift properly by applying force directly into the ground through the mechanics of a vertical jump. So you get these people who are like actively pulling the bar with bent arms into their hips. And we don't need to go down the rabbit hole of should you Olympic lift with straight or bent arms, but they're so fixated on double knee bend and aggressive hip contact that they're completely glossing over what they need to be doing, which is applying force to the ground. Wild tangent there, but it's just experiences, right? Like they've experienced Olympic lifting coached to them in a way or explained to them in a way that doesn't necessarily lend itself to skill acquisition and task performance.
Yeah. So what do you think about John North's coaching the snatch?
Yeah, drill that he does where he bangs the bar off his hips.
Smashes his hips with it.
You know, and every drill has value, and I have used drills similar to that, and kind of like cues that go against what I think is good weightlifting technique. Like I'll tell people, like, you need to push down through your heels, and it ends in an outcome that I'm happy with, but it's definitely not for everybody.
Yeah. Okay.
But do I think that John Norris, it's one of two likely possibilities. He doesn't understand what he's doing, or two, he understands it in a way that he is comfortable coaching and he sees results from these drills.
Yeah.
Like he just organizes around the outcome very, very well. He's an athletic guy.
Mhm.
And he just thinks things are different than they are.
Yeah. Yeah. The weightlifting example is a good one because it's easy to get lost in the positioning, those, the different stages of the pull, and just completely forget about what you're actually needing to do, which is just producing bar height, right? Vertical force production. But those different stages are just a result of that with the barbell as a constraint.
Exactly.
It's definitely an interesting and a different ways. And, different people will probably respond better, right? To either thinking about it more as a jump or thinking about the positioning much more.
That kind of leads us towards like implicit and explicit instruction, where, I don't know, let's start with the benefits, right? Like explicit instruction. So you're telling your athlete exactly what they need to do, exactly how to do it. It's really good for early motor skill development. You can get them to do simple to moderately complex tasks fairly well. Where it really starts to break down is in retention. There's too many steps for us to really kind of like retain. Whereas implicit coaching styles are more based in that ecological dynamics where we provide a constraint such as a barbell. We provide a task outcome. I want you to bring this barbell from the floor to overhead and go. And then you can kind of like organize around that and you get better and better and better. Or in a lot of cases, you just don't, right? Like you don't have some of the required, I don't know, qualities to do it, whether it be flexibility, mobility, speed, accuracy, balance, coordination, all of those things. They just don't exist for you to be able to do it within that constraint of lifting a barbell to overhead. I forget where I was going with that. Implicit, explicit coaching, blending the two. A lot of times when I'm coaching, I try and blend those two concepts together. So I'll give them a very clearly defined explicit goal that they need to achieve. And then the instruction I give is organize yourself around this goal. Okay. I don't want you to force yourself into this box that you have this preconceived notion around what is correct. I want you to think about the outcome and make that the sole focus. So let's say in the jerk, for example, right? Somebody's struggling with maintaining a vertical torso in the dip. I'm going to say the purpose of the dip and the drive is to move the barbell over your head. So I want you to drive the barbell over your head and then press your body into the bottom of the split. And oftentimes they understand that kind of implicit coaching strategy a little bit better, where there's some explicit detail, but there's the opportunity for them to self-organize around it. They can choose their own stance. They can choose how they dip. As long as they know that that barbell needs to finish over their head, they're likely to organize around it.
Yeah. You're probably constantly kind of, shifting in and out of more or less explicit just as things develop, right? Or as the session even progresses, maybe more fatigue, it has to become more explicit. Or, different movements, they need more explicit coaching than others. And it's probably just kind of this constantly kind of flowing, changing interaction, right?
You know, the way that I like to balance that is by appropriate demand. So early on in a session, we'll always start by laying groundwork. If I'm going to tell you where barbell overhead is, I want you to feel it first. So we just train that position. We do snatch presses, snatch push presses, overhead squats, drop snatches, tall snatches, so on and so forth. Right? They're technical movements, but really what we're doing is we're laying a foundation so that we can put a whole bunch of reps in this good bucket and then start layering complexity on top of that. And then as fatigue starts to develop, then we're going to pull back and we're going to go back to more basic, again, self-organized tasks where let's say we start a session and it's heavy and snatch balance. Like you came to the gym the other weekend. So you're going to recognize this flow as I described it, right? The concept of where are you going? So where do we want to see the bar in the bottom of our snatch? Okay. We're going to learn to press it into the correct position. Very explicit instructions around this. And then we're going to overhead squat with it. Very explicit instructions around this. And then we're going to start to kind of become more implicit. We already know where the bottom of the squat is. I want to get there as quick as possible. So now we're doing drop snatches, no dip or drive. We're just pushing into the bottom of our overhead squat. And now we can start including more snatch specific drills. We'll add a dip and a drive. We'll do snatch balance. Okay. More explicit instructions. Again, I need you to finish your drive and then push yourself into that receiving position. Know where you're going. Then we start progressing back to more explicit instructions. We're going to do how do we lift the barbell into a position by which we can get underneath it? Snatch deadlift, snatch pull, muscle snatch, pull snatch, and then finally some sort of snatch complex with a small focus, right? And now we're coming back again. We've gone through this wave of explicit, implicit, explicit, implicit. And then we're going to go back down to implicit and we'll do something like snatch pulls. Right? All I care about is that you push into the ground as hard as you possibly can.
Yeah. Yeah. And that also incorporates the different kind of the different sensory components too, right? So you've got the explicit and implicit, which is, varying throughout the session with the different movements, but you're also feeling the position, right? So the learning is there's knowledge coming in, you're learning, explicitly, but you're also feeling it, right? And then you're making some mistakes and you're correcting them. And it's all about the kind of the balance of all these different kind of modalities, all these different ways that we can learn, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a good snatch session.
Thanks.
It's just,
Thought a few of them. Have you read Nick Winkelman, Gabrielle Wolf?
no.
No. So they talk a lot about internal and external focus. And things that go along with that. And that's more about like the communication and cueing around exercise. So we've got kind of like three main domains of communicating and cueing: visual, verbal, and tactile. And verbal is going to be the one that we lean on the most heavily because it's our primary means of communication, obviously, right? Like we see things to understand the world around us. We touch things to understand the world around us, but we use words to communicate ideas. So our verbal language is going to be the most powerful communication and cueing tool that we have. And they talk about internal and external focus, where internal focus would be, telling you to do things within your body. Squeeze your glutes, raise your arm overhead. That's starting to become more broad, but we've got like the narrowest of focus in internal, moving towards broad internal, and then transitioning towards narrow external, broad external. So a very narrow internal focus would be something like squeeze your glutes, right? More broad internal, raise your arm overhead. As we start transitioning into external focus, reach for the ceiling. Same movement, different cueing strategy. Okay? And then even more broad external would be some sort of task, some sort of implicit task that you could describe around that. I don't know, more than reach for the ceiling, be like a tree. Right? That's kind of like the continuum of internal towards external focus. And their research, at least, has demonstrated that external focus and skill acquisition and motor skill quality tends to be higher with more complex movements when we focus on external.
Yeah, it makes sense too, right? It's like having the external focus is more in line with a task than something that's going on inside your body, right? The task is not inside your body. So focusing inside your body doesn't really make sense for accomplishing an external goal, but it probably does work pretty well for like bodybuilding or something like that, right? Where your goal is actually just the muscle contraction, in a sense. But yeah, external versus internal use. Yeah, I downloaded Nick Winkelman's book recently. I haven't gotten to it yet, but we read read some of his published works a while ago. Not Gabrielle Wolf though.
She's got quite a few available papers. She's got a book,
Yeah,
Attentional Focus and Motor Learning.
right.
It's called.
It's good.
It's like it's got a bunch of references in it that I like to different studies and stuff like that was done, that were done. A lot of that stuff is done around compromised patients, like people with Parkinson's or neurological disease. So it's really interesting to see how all of this stuff applies. Like a lot of the work that's done in fatigue is done in patients with MS
Mm,
because they're obviously have to try harder to do things.
yeah.
Another point that I kind of highlighted here is the role of creating an understanding around a movement so that people have context, I think. And we kind of touched on, or you touched on that a little bit, of if I understand the goal, then I can start to self-organize around that goal. And for me personally, I made my greatest strides in technical proficiency when I really understood certain movements. So the big aha moment for me in weightlifting was I attended one of those Moss strength weightlifting seminars. And then I read his book, and they've got these 5 tenets of 4, 5 of weightlifting: close, fast, low, timing, and stable. Our goal is to lift the bar to a height where we can get underneath and fix it into an overhead position. Okay? To do that, we need to keep the bar as close to the frontal plane as possible, so right over the middle of our foot. That's going to make it easiest to get underneath it. Close, fast. We need to accelerate the bar to create a weightless moment. We need to be fast in getting underneath that bar because gravity is equal. The gravity is going to push that bar down at the same rate that it puts our body down. So we need to be fast in getting underneath the bar. We need to get low underneath the bar. We need to beat the bar into our low position. We need to have good timing so that the bar is not crashing down on us. And we need to receive it in a stable position. And that's like the framework for developing Olympic lifting: close, fast, low, timing, stable. And when you start to understand that, then you can really design training programs, technique progressions around these kind of 5 tenets of successful weightlifting. And it was the same thing when I was developing my gymnastics. Once I started to get a grasp for like the ring muscle, it was something that I struggled with for years, but the concepts of like arch and tension and how the ring straps play a role in that. And then I started digging deep into like Thomas Myers, anatomy trains, fascia. And it was like, okay, I understand how I need to organize my body to maximize whole body tension. Then I started making great progress in the ring muscle up. But before that, I was just throwing darts. Like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just going to do more of it. But having that understanding, and as coaches, it should be our goal to impart at least part of that understanding on our clients so that they don't need you all the time. If your client needs you, you're not making an athlete, you're making a dependent.
Do you kind of try to read early on how much, where the kind of the balance of education versus coaching is? Like some people will glaze over pretty quick when you're just delivering information, right? So how do you kind of strike the balance between trying to teach them all these things so that they can be more kind of self-reliant versus you kind of losing them with, too much science or whatever, right?
Have you ever read the book How to Win Friends and Influence People?
Yeah, it's one of my favorites.
So one of the first examples is like this guy, he's coming for a job interview. He walks into the boss's office. He notices a model car on the desk, starts talking about vintage cars. So, and this comes back to ecological dynamics, past experience. What your goal should be when you're delivering information, and this was covered in some of the papers, is creating a positive learning environment, right? So sometimes I find people respond really well to stories, right? Like I've got a decent history in the sport, so I'll tell a story of something that happened in CrossFit that's relevant to where I'm going to go next. And then that's like the hook. And now people are starting to listen. And once I've got them hooked, then I can start giving them information that they might have otherwise been reluctant to hear or just otherwise not interested in, right? But that's kind of the game that I play with people is I try and create a positive learning environment. And then my backup strategy is always relatability. Right? So I use the example of car racing. With if you're not pushing the limit, then you're not getting better. But we could use the same example with learning how to play a song on the piano. So I've got this client, I know that they're in music. Oh, cool. Well, when you learn to play a new song on your guitar, like you don't just rip through that thing start to finish, glossing over your mistakes. You play to a mistake, you make your mistake and you go back. And your goal is going to be either to go from the very start of that song through the mistake without making a mistake, or you'll chunk it out, right? And you just go back as far as you need to work on that specific rhythmic piece. And that's how you develop that song. And eventually, if you practice well enough, deliberately enough, then you'll be able to put together the whole song, which is the snatch. It's a concert of components. So just figuring out how you get that hook so that you can create a level of understanding within people. That's to answer your question with as many words as possible. That's how I solved that issue where people would otherwise be reluctant or just like not really all that engaged. There's lots of strategies that you can employ as a coach to get people to pay attention to you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good approach. Just open up the learning environment, open them up to learning rather than kind of being delicate with the delivery and hoping or whatever, right?
Yeah, we might be inclined to different strategies that do work with some people and don't work with others, right? Like the strategy of consequences. I might have an athlete. Typically, these are going to be male athletes where I'm like, listen, dude, if you don't do this, you're going to suck for the rest of your life. And they're like, oh shit, I better pull up my socks and do this the way the coach is telling me to do it. But if I say that to somebody who's a little bit more sensitive, they're going to be like, this guy's an asshole. And they start to shut down. And it's worse than tuning out. It's that they're like, now they're starting to be like, I don't like this person. And so you do have to be very tactful with the strategies that you employ when you're trying to create positive learning environments.
Yeah, definitely. Not the easiest thing.
No, it's not. I'm sure you can relate to this because it didn't come naturally to me. It took a lot of study and reflection and practice because I am very much an introverted personality, as you are too, right? Like I'm sure you can relate to this. So you kind of have to put on like a bit of an act, but it's not fake. I mean, like I think that's the important part for coaches and for anybody who's listening to this who may be forming an opinion of me is it's not fake because it's a means to an end. My goal as a coach is to impart positive change. And if I have to behave like somebody that doesn't come natural to me to impart that positive change on a student or an athlete, then I will do that because it's a tool that I have in my toolbox.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a skill that you practice and acquire, right? Like public speaking and, social dynamics. Like us, maybe not super comfortable with those things at first, and then you practice it and you get better. And, nobody's the same. Nobody has the same like types of interactions or relationships with all different types of people, right? We change all the time. That doesn't mean it's fake. It just is context.
Mm-hmm.
So it's another skill.
It is another skill, yeah, that needs to be learned and acquired.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What about 10,000 hours?
Deliberate. It has to be reps in a good bucket. 10,000 hours, 10 years, whatever it is. It's interesting to see just the straight representation of hours and how that correlated to performance. But I do stand by that they need to be deliberate hours. It can't just be like going through the motions.
Yeah. And there is no guarantee that 10,000 hours or 10,000 reps or 10 years is going to get you there. It's like, it was a cool thing to say, but it seems like it wasn't really based on much. In the papers that we read, there was anywhere from 7,000 to 18,000 hours retrospectively, right? So it's like they're trying to remember how many hours they put in. So it's not even tracked prospectively. So it seems like it's not necessary, nor is it sufficient, which is kind of makes it almost meaningless.
I think what it really comes down to is the quality of your work. And again, we could just leave it at quality of work and kind of like branch that out into the way in which you practice. And I personally think that outcome-based practice, this like constraints with self-organization, a blend of implicit and explicit coaching, is the best way to learn and develop a motor skill. But if like I give in my clients, I give them extensive barbell warm-ups for snatch and clean and jerk. And it's like every 3 or 4 weeks, I drop a note in, film this for me, and there's cleanup that needs to happen. And they're starting to just like go from very, very high task engagement. And then it's like, oh, I did this last week. I did this last week. I did this last week. Why am I still doing this? And then, I see the videos. I'm like, you are not doing this anymore. The 2 warm-ups that you did between last week and 5 weeks ago are completely different warm-ups. You need to focus on these things when you're doing this. Otherwise, it's a complete waste of time.
Yeah. Nice. What do you think?
I feel like that was pretty comprehensive.
Yeah, that was good.
Bit scattered, but what can we expect? That's a broad subject.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we could, we'll probably pick something out of this and then we could come back to it and dive into something in detail, but a cool little overarching look.
Yeah. I gotta go though. I gotta go pick up my hour.
Yeah.
Okay.
Have a good weekend.
You too.
Yeah. Cheers.
Bye.